And meeting is live.
Okay, Madam Mayor, we're back live and it's 5:20.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam City Clerk. We are going to continue on, and hopefully we worked out all of our technical difficulties so we don't have to stand by. And I don't know who will be starting us off, Leon?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All
Yeah.
right. So thanks everyone for your patience. Hopefully we don't have any more technical problems. We were actually about to start our first interactive exercise that we wanted to do with you. It's called Laying It on the Line. And so the exercise actually starts with an opportunity to use some of the annotated features that we can that you can use virtually that I want to walk you through shortly. But before we show you how to use the annotated feature, I just want to describe what the activity is. We'll probably be doing this for about, we'll try to keep it maybe more condensed since we used up more time than we expected with the technical problems, but maybe about 15 minutes. So we're gonna put up a statement. As we put up a statement, there are only two rules that you need to be aware of. Only two rules that apply to this activity. The first rule is that there isn't actually a right or wrong answer to the statement. So when we put up the statement is carefully crafted where each of you may have a very different interpretation of it. And it's really designed for that to be a way for you to kind of understand how each of us process information. So we'll put up the statement, depending on how you react, you will react the way you react because it's how you're interpreting the statement. And the second is you can't ask anyone to interpret it. You can't ask Rita, you can't ask me, or you can't ask, for those that are in the same room with each other, you can't ask each other. This is supposed to be a you by yourself exercise, kind of deciding how you're processing it. And so the first rule, no right or wrong answer. The second rule, don't ask anyone to interpret it for you. And so when we put up the first statement, based upon how you interpret the statement, we want you to use the annotated feature that we'll show you how to kind of use shortly to decide whether you strongly disagree, whether you're leaning disagree, whether you're neutral, leaning agree, or strongly agree. And so we want you to indicate where you are based upon that. And because of the sake of time, we're probably just going to take maybe just 3 comments, depending on where you are, just to kind of. And part of what we wanted you to just be able to share what about the statement that you reacted to? Was there a word that was said in that statement? Was there something about the statement that made you want to put yourself on different parts of the line? And just want you to create the space where you're hearing and listening to each other, right? And this is really just trying to really set the tone for dialogue where we're not necessarily attacking one another. We're not necessarily saying you're wrong, because there isn't a right or wrong answer. It's just how you've interpreted it. So, and just want to create the space where you're having a chance to be able to have some of that dialogue in this virtual context. All right, so rule 1, no right or wrong answer. Rule 2, don't ask anyone to interpret it for you. And so from in terms of how to navigate the annotated feature, Rita, you want to, since I'm sharing my screen, you want to help people navigate to the annotation?
Absolutely. Now that we have it back. So if you could mute yourself, Leon, that'll help the echo. Great. So again, now, if you move your cursor across the top of the screen, and again, for the commissioners, we'll ask you to voice your votes. But for the rest of you who do have computers, your cursor across the top will give you a little green bar, and to the right of the green bar is a black box that says View Options, and it has a drop-down menu to the right. The third item below, once you do the drop-down, says Annotate. If you click on Annotate, you'll get a new menu that lets you pick your own personalized symbol. And we suggest that you go to Stamp, which is the 4th option. If you put your cursor over the stamp box, you have 6 different symbols: an arrow, a check mark, an X, a star, a heart, and a question mark. Pick one. I'm going to pick a heart. I've selected heart, and I'm going to put my cursor on the strongly agree end of the line, and my heart shows up. Or I can put it at the other end and it shows up there, and I put it here. Now, 1 vote per statement, 1 vote per person, and you can pick your symbol. And once Leon reads the statement, you're going to let us know where you are on the continuum. whether you strongly agree with the statement, whether you're neutral about that statement, or if you strongly disagree with that statement, or anywhere in between. And then we'll clear the screen before we go to the next statement. So I'm going to clear what I've drawn. I can see other people are playing around with it, so that's good. That means that it's working for you. Any questions before we barrel ahead? Yeah, I see some stars. That's good. All right. Has everyone picked their stamp, their personalized stamp? If so, I'll turn it back to Leon to read the first statement, and I'm going to clear the drawings.
The first statement is people who engage in public meetings are the ones who care most about the issues. People who engage in public meetings are the ones who care most about the issues. Do you strongly disagree with that statement? Are you leaning that way? Are you neutral? Are you leaning agree? All right, so give each of you a chance to kind of, great. Just give it a few more seconds. Looks like folks have figured out how to use the annotation. Great job. All right, so this is, I want to start on the strongly agree side. And if you whoever is kind of the heart or the check, if one of you could unmute yourself and as a way of introduction, just saying who you are, what department or where you're from, what agency you're from, and just kind of indicate for us, again, there's no right or wrong answer, what about the statement that made you want to say strongly agree? Whoever my check or heart person was, or I think there could be some folks up here that I think are also leaning. I'm not sure if you're putting yourself up here in the area. Is that Alicia? Are you checking up here? Or H. Robinson?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. This is Debbie Andrea. I'm the city clerk. And I agree because when I go to these meetings and attend these meetings, usually the people that are there are, most of the time, are there because the issue affects them. And they're the ones that care most about that particular issue. They don't necessarily care what's going on in a different part of town, but they certainly care about something that's going to affect their lives.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Acknowledging if they're showing up many times, most of the time they're sharing up because they care a lot about these issues, and which is the reason why they share, why they're showing up. So acknowledging that, wanting to kind of, again, there's probably several versions of that are probably falling on this line, but we want to kind of make sure we're moving this along a little bit just because we're running a little bit behind. Wanting to find out folks that are in this neutral space, if you could introduce one of you that can indicate why you put yourself more in this neutral space. If you can unmute yourself and give us a sense of what about the statement put you there.
Hey, this is Andre McAdden. I chose neutral because someone can care about an issue, but may have other circumstances that may prevent them from being as involved or as active as they would like to be. There are many times that items may come up, whether it's within a city function or whatever type of entity. Because they don't show up for this particular event, meeting, or item, they may have some involvement in other ways. So to take one action and use that as a gauge to say that it's that person's level of interest, I think wouldn't be capturing the full scope of that individual.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Andre. Just kind of acknowledging that, which is a very good neutral space. Like they could really, the folks that are sharing up might really care, but it may not be the full story, right? In terms of, do they care the most, right? Just kind of acknowledging that there may be other factors, and as you're trying to process if they care the most about it. So I appreciate you naming that. And again, I know folks may have some version that might vary based upon what Andre has said, but I want to move my way to folks that are more in the strongly disagree area, folks that are finding themselves in this space. If you can unmute yourself and maybe share what about this statement puts you in the strongly disagree.
Vice Mayor Pro Tem wanted to make a comment.
Could I?
Sure.
Thank you, Leon. I'm leaning a little bit left of neutral, and I'll tell you why. You know, while it's true that folks that come to our meetings are passionate oftentimes about the issue, the harsh reality it is that a lot of folks don't attend our meetings for a variety of reasons, whether it's work related, that they can't make the meeting, or some other barrier for participation. And you know, I'd say I'm a little left of neutral. Yes, the folks that show up, they're pretty passionate about it, but I would guess that for every person that shows up, there's probably 50 other people that feel the same way or disagree on the issue, but for whatever reason haven't made the meeting because of the barriers that may exist in their reality.
No, thank you for naming that, Mayor Pro Tem. That's acknowledging that folks that are showing up might care, but it may not necessarily be a full representation, right, of everyone that cares. So appreciate you acknowledging that. And what about someone that's on the more strongly disagree? We want to kind of acknowledge what about the statement put you here, lean more into strongly disagree?
You're gonna have to call out names.
Yeah, well, yeah, this can be, for the most part, anonymous unless we actually saw your name when you clicked it. But yeah, anyone.
Leon, it's Ron. I'll take a crack at it.
Go ahead, Ron.
I originally was planted on strongly disagreeing. I slid it over a little bit more, but I have to echo Andre and both Commissioner Maxwell's responses because it's kind of a tricky deal. I strongly disagreed because there's other platforms and there's other means of engaging the city for residents, constituents to express their concerns or, you know, or what they feel like about issues. You don't always have to be present, to Commissioner Maxwell's point, to be engaged. So, you know, with the event of social media, emails, phone calls, you know, which we get all those forms of communication for people who are very strongly concerned or want their, you know, 2 cents read into the record or, you know, talk about an issue that's important to them. So that's why, you know, the question was kind of, you know, a little tricky, but that's why I initially strongly disagreed and then slid over a little bit more toward neutral, because I can agree with both of the gentlemen on their takes.
Appreciate that reflection, Juan. And you know, I think that again really does reflect how this example, why someone that's on the strongly agree, even to the strongly disagree and neutral, you might find yourself on a strongly disagree, but your perspective may not be that far off from the person that's in the neutral. So how we listen to each other, even as people are taking positions, is important to kind of, part of what we're trying to do is create the space where you're modeling, being able to realize how can we listen at the same time realizing we may not have necessarily reacted initially to the same statement in the same way, right? And so I appreciate you just kind of acknowledging that as you were listening, Juan, to some of the other comments. So we're going to move on to the next statement. And
yeah, I think Commissioner Robinson has his hand up.
Sure, Commissioner Robinson.
Commissioner, you're muted.
We go. Sorry, I just got the unmute sign there. To Commissioner Maxwell's point, yes, there's probably a lot more people that don't participate than do and have an opinion. My concern and their concern is being heard and their comments and opinions affecting change. Thank you.
No, thanks for acknowledging that. I appreciate that, Commissioner Robinson, just acknowledging for some people, it's also naming that even when they do express their perspective or objection or support, does it lead to people actually hearing their voice or leading to any particular change? And that could also lead to people choosing not to engage anymore, right? As they feel like their voices are not being heard, right? As we talk about how people maybe fall on the line of caring. They might care a whole lot, but feel like they've now chose just not to disengage because of their experience. So I appreciate you naming that. So any other hands up before we move on to the next? Just checking here real quickly. I don't see any other hands up. Okay. All right, Reed, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
And I'm going to unmute. All right. We have another statement for you to respond to. Hiring and promotion decisions should be based solely on merit. Hiring and promotion decisions should be based solely on merit. So put your marks: disagree, neutral, strongly agree, or somewhere in between. All right, I see the tallies are showing up healthily there. We've got folks along the whole spectrum once again, which is great because it allows for us to hear each other's perspectives. So I'll give it another minute. Anyone else want to place their mark? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. So let's start on the strongly agree side. Who wants to tell us why they're actually, we have a check mark on the super agree side. So if someone will own this green check mark, that would be great. And tell us why you agree that hiring and promotion decisions should be based solely on merit. We could take a yellow star as well, but someone unmute yourself and give us your perspective.
So I saw two names. This is as they were checking it. I saw someone that his last name is Seeger, S-E-E-G-E-R. Who is E. Seeger? Where are you at? Come out, come out.
Oh, here I am. I was trying to unmute myself. Hiring and promotion decisions should be based solely on merit.
Ernestine, you're muted.
Muted. Am I unmuted now? You hear me fine?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, sometimes a position is created from necessity, and a certain staff member may be quote unquote voluntold to man that position. And while they're in that position, they get on-the-job training and they're successful, and then it grows. So I do agree that it should be based on merit, but not solely on merit 100% of the time.
That's great. Thank you for interpreting the statement and sharing with us your perspective. And thank you, Leon, for catching the name so we could get some voices into the conversation. So thank you, Ernestine. So let's move to more towards neutral. Who is in the middle, a bit undecided, or depends on the situation for this statement? Anyone in this cluster, maybe the heart or one of the stars? Someone unmute yourself and tell us why you're neutral on this statement about merit. Leon, did your photographic memory catch any names on that one?
Oh, I think Jason, I saw you. Is it Jason Bailey? Were you in the middle here? I think I saw you click there in the middle.
Negative, I would strongly agree.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. So I don't remember, Rita, sorry. So folks would have to, this is obviously, you folks would have to lean in, and we obviously have facilitators. We don't want to call you out. This is a space for you to feel free to share. And again, there's no right or wrong answer.
Right. I was going to restate that as well. People are clearly on the continuum. So anyone in this cluster, give us a scenario why you are not at either end of the spectrum around hiring and promotion decisions. We know there's some voices there.
Yeah, this is at liberty. I'll bring myself forward on this one.
Thank you.
I went into the neutral category because the definition of merit depends on who you're asking. It's often in the eye of the reader or the beholder or the person who has a stake in the outcome, either personally or for their candidate. If we're dealing with, on one end of the spectrum, somebody could say, hey, merit is the highest level of education, most number of years of experience in the position, and highest grades. And other situations, it might be dictated by a contract, for example, that requires that somebody has the highest position with the company or in that particular position is the person who merits the position. So it's just using the word merit is one that's subject to the interpretation of the person who's using that word, and it can be used in many different purposes, different ways.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And again, as we mentioned when we started reading these statements, there are words that will make you interpret it one way or another. So your focus on merit makes what you said very clear. So I appreciate you sharing that perspective. Sounds like you're looking at each situation as being unique, and you will judge the situation as the need arises. So thanks for stepping in and leaning into the voicing of your opinion on that one. So let's move down to strongly disagree. There aren't as many at this end, but I see 3 or 4, this green check, the heart, star. Anyone who is more in the disagree end of the hiring and promotion statement. We want a courageous voice. And again,
I'm Melissa Coyne. I'm in the clerk's office.
Thanks, Melissa.
I'm the star of the night.
I like that.
Actually, for me, I'm a very literal person, which can be really annoying. But for me, it was the word solely. And I think there are other things that should be taken into consideration. Obviously, the person should merit the position to be hired or be promoted, but also how well would they mesh with the team that's already in place? And there might be other things you're looking for other than somebody who actually merits the position that you have to take into consideration. So that's why I said I disagreed.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for introducing that context. And again, as you can see, merit swayed some people, solely has swayed you. And you want to bring other factors into your decision-making process. So that gives us the continuum. So appreciate you sharing your perspective. We do have one more statement that will probably generate a similar continuum of responses. So Leon's going to read the next one.
All right, thank you, Rita, and everyone for your comments. Our final statement here is, I believe we can end racial inequity. I believe we can end racial inequity. Strongly disagree, neutral, strongly agree, or somewhere in between. I believe we can end racial inequity. I believe we can end racial inequity. Giving you guys just a couple more seconds to put it down. I believe we can end racial inequity. There are about, what, 50 or 48 of you guys on the call? I'm not sure if this looks like 48 checks or marks, but I'll give you 5 more seconds. I believe we can end racial inequity. All right, great. All right, we're going to start on the strongly disagree side here, and wanted to see those that are kind of leaning on the strongly disagree side. What about this statement puts you here? I believe we can end racial inequity. So anyone that's kind of in this space here, the four of you guys are in that space. All right. Well, this is the challenge virtually. This is where now both Reed and I, as your facilitators, have to try to find ways of drawing you out because everyone's kind of waiting to see who's going to talk first. Or
This is Andre again. I'll go. I didn't want to be the.
No, and I appreciate that,
one to keep
Andre,
going,
but I appreciate you trying to model it. So for now, go ahead and share share if you were down on this end, if you wanted to share why you were down there.
I'm down on that end because in my view, the disparity of racial equity is so strongly ingrained in our society, and it is permeated so many generations that it's going to take, in my view, it'll take generations for it to neutralize or get to any point where you can say that is ending. Given all of the events that we've seen, just in my lifetime, there are people on the video that are older than me that have seen a lot more. In some respects, we can say that it appears that things have gotten better over the decades. But in other viewpoints, you can say that things just became hidden over the decades. It didn't necessarily get better. They were just covered up. And so until there is a fully concerted effort to completely understand the multitude of cultures that in this country, I don't believe it would change. Growing up, there were so many of us were taught to tolerate, and as opposed to understand that now tolerance is the modus operandi for now, as opposed to understanding. If we move the continuum more towards understanding, then yes, I would change my viewpoint to strongly agree. But if we stick to tolerance, which essentially just says, I don't have to like you, I don't have to respect you, I only need to tolerate you for this period of time, as opposed to understanding, meaning I'm learning you, I can see more of you, we are communicating. Until we get more on that side, then I don't see it changing.
No, thank you, Andre. Thanks for sharing and again modeling with your participation and just acknowledging. I appreciate what you're naming. That as we think about our history and think about how you've processed how we've been, how different people have been taught. Whether it's tolerance or not addressing it directly. Can we really, can we really end it, right? As we're talking about what it takes to end it. So appreciate you naming that and bringing that into the space. Really important to kind of, for folks that others may be in that space. I appreciate you naming it. Curious about those that are in the neutral space, what puts you there? There's several of you here in the middle or somewhere close to the middle. If you could share why you put yourself in the middle, neutral. I can say I did see some, is it Lauren, L-O-R-E-N, Lauren?
I'll jump in on this. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Unique, is it Unique? Yep.
Yeah, Yannick.
Got it.
I work for the finance department. I actually work with Andre. So I chose neutral in part, kind of like what Andre was saying, because of the progress we've made. I think what's been happening over the past few years has been covered mainly because of the technology that we have. I mean, now we have cameras in our phones. It's easy to capture all these events. So it's easy to feel hopeless. But I'm more hopeful only because of the progress that has been made. And we are continuing to make progress. And the reason why I didn't choose strongly agree is just I just don't see the end of it. But I see improvement, but not the end of it. And that's why I chose neutral.
Oh, thank you, Yannick. That's great. Acknowledging improvement, but not sure if we can get there, fully end it. So I appreciate you naming that. And what about folks that are maybe more leaning in the strongly agree side? I would love to hear maybe a voice or two that found themselves over in the strongly agree side.
Hi, this is Ernestine again.
Okay, go ahead, Ernestine.
And what I would like to say is we have to give it a concerted effort. We have to try. If we stand in a position and say we can't do it, nothing will ever get done. We have to try. And each one can reach one. If each one gives some type of effort and reach one, then it would roll. It would be an avalanche. It would roll. And we have to try. And we do it through, just like Andre said, through understanding, through communication, and through a concerted effort. And if we just stand still and do nothing and keep lamenting about how it has been and what happened in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it'll stay the same. But we have to try. We have to move forward, and we have to forget about all of that stuff. Each one reach one, and nothing beats a failure but a try. You have to try.
Thank you, Ernestine, for sharing that in the space. Love to kind of hear if there's anyone within that Ernestine corner that wants to also reflect and build off of what Ernestine just said. Wanted to make sure we create a space for your voice.
Vice Mayor, do you have something?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
So this is the Vice Mayor, Andy Amoroso. As a gay man, I'm right down the middle. I totally agree with her. And, I'd like to break it down. I truly believe, I'm concerned with the word we. Who is we? Across America, it needs to be more than just Lake Worth and Lake Worth Beach. We, I think, is a large picture, but I believe we, depending on who we are, can make a change. To end, I'd like to change that word to change. I think end is I believe that we can get to an end, but I think we need to start with change.
I appreciate that, Vice Mayor. And I think you picked up on a couple of things in the statement as it was carefully designed that I want to just acknowledge. Before I do that, let me just see if there's anyone else in that strongly agree side that wants to bring their voice before I kind of acknowledge a couple of things before we move on. Okay, great. Well, I think what the Vice Mayor is picking up on were some of the key words that were intentional in this statement, as was the case in the other two. The first is one thing to pick up on. I want to pick up on the we, as the Vice Mayor was asking, who is the we? And that's really important in terms of how you interpret that. If you think about the we being everyone in the country, we being everyone in the state of Florida, right? Or we being Lake Worth Beach, or we being folks in my community, in my neighborhood, you might have a different reaction to whether you agree or disagree, right? And many times when we bring this statement up, people, depending on how you define the we, if you define the we in a very big way, it might feel overwhelming, right? It might feel like, wow, that would be a lot to really, what we can do to really end it, right? How can we end it if we're thinking about the whole country or a much larger group? But some people that feel more positive about that lean themselves more towards strongly agree, when they define the we in a much more controlled space. Like, what could we do in our city, in our town, in our neighborhood, in our church, or however you define that we? And so I appreciate the Vice Mayor kind of acknowledging that, because that's really important as you start doing this work, how you start defining what the we is as you do the work. And then the ending racial inequity is and I appreciate the Vice Mayor acknowledging that part too, right? When we talk about ending racial inequity, what are we actually talking about? Are we, is it inequity of outcomes? Is it inequity of opportunity? Is it inequity of conditions? Depending on how you define what the inequity is, might feel either more manageable or more overwhelming. So as you start to define what are you trying to end and what can you do, we could be city council, we be the city. Could we end racial inequity of opportunity? We want to make sure everyone has the same opportunity. So we want to end the inequities of opportunity, right? And defining what those opportunities are, that's different than maybe trying to end maybe the inequity of outcomes. And inequity of outcomes might be feel more overwhelming. Right. And so how you define what the ending is, how you define what that racial inequity is also really important to just name as you're thinking about it. And that's another space where we find when we do this statement, people have different reactions to. And then the other is the believe space. I believe. And the first is I, which speaks to you as a person. As you're here in the room today, in the virtual room today, how do you feel? I believe. How do I, me, whatever my name is, feel, believe? And what does it mean to believe in that space? And that belief space is very much at the core of the statement, right? If for those that are standing that may find themselves more in the strongly disagree, they may not believe. It doesn't mean that don't want to believe or they don't want to feel like that, but maybe at this moment today, depending on everything that's going on, you feel like, I just don't believe we can get there, right? And part of that belief might be you looking at being very pragmatic, saying like, man, I've seen all that this country has gone through, our whole history, all the stuff we've been taught, and I just don't believe we can get there, right? And it's important to acknowledge that could be how you're feeling right now, right? And I just also want to acknowledge, 5 days removed, both Rita and I being here in Washington, D.C., everyone seeing the riots and the insurrections that have happened here in Washington, D.C., you could feel some kind of way about, do you actually believe we can actually end racial inequity, right? And it's important to hold and to name that, right? And on any given day, any of us could feel like, I just don't believe we can get there, right? And so it's important to know that as we talk about, as we lean into this work today and tomorrow, to know like part of that space is like, how am I feeling the based upon kind of what's happening in my environment, right? And the people that are leaning more in the strongly agree space, having a little bit more hope, they're feeling a little bit more hopeful, right? And I appreciate Ernestine kind of naming some of the hope. And if you saw what I was trying to do, I was trying to create the space. Are there any more people feeling hopeful on the call? Like if you are feeling more hopeful, that actually is important for your colleagues to hear, right? To be able to do this work, to be able to encourage each other, as you start to hear that hopeful, if you find yourself not feeling very hopeful, hearing your colleagues or somebody else feeling more hopeful encourages them to find their way back to being hopeful, right? Which is why we wanted to create the space for you to kind of create some hopeful space, depending on where your colleagues are. How do you encourage each other if you're committed to doing this work as a city? Because on any given day, I don't know what each of you are sitting with, but I do know, even I knowing myself, and I just had a staff meeting with our team earlier, there's a lot of feelings about what's been happening in the last week, right? And you got to create the space of helping people kind of share that, but also trying to help people find their way back to a hopeful space. And that's why we want to we do a lot of statements when we can kind of get started, but this one is one we try to end with because we don't know where you are, but we acknowledge that to be able to do this work, how do you find your way back to hope? And that's where we want to lay that foundation as you're leaning in, knowing that as we start to define this, as we start to think about what the work is, that what it looks like within the city of Lake Worth Beach will be very different than any other part of the country. And that's your work to try to really define what that looks like as you do this work. And so that being said, I want to be able to create the space just to kind of lay that as a foundation. I know we want to make sure we're kind of allowing ourselves to really start the space of really getting you guys to start talking. Really appreciate those that have been leaning in and creating this space to dialogue. We want to continue to be able to create some more space for that. But want to, as we kind of pivot a little bit more, want to begin to introduce for you kind of the framework that we talked about early on. So I'm going to turn that over to Rita.
Thanks, Leon. Appreciate it. And really appreciated all of you helping us move along the continuum of those statements. And ending with some voices of hope. So thank you for that. When we went through the objectives for this training, Leon mentioned these three words: normalize, operationalize, and organize. And this is the framework on which we have crafted the work that we share with all the cities we're working with these days. And most of our time today and tomorrow is really focused on getting to that level of comfort that we call normalizing. Comfort and confidence and resilience and openly communicating about race and equity. It's about acknowledging the reality of racism and getting comfortable with leaning into that difficult acknowledgement, getting it on the table, sharing our experiences and perspectives so that it's no longer something we either deny or pretend doesn't exist. So that normalizing process isn't instantaneous. It doesn't happen, like we said earlier, with one training, check the box, we're done, and we can move on. It takes practice. It takes iteration. It takes repetition. It takes getting to that acknowledgement and admission to one another so that then you can go to the next level. And those next levels are the two other planks of this platform, so to speak. Once you've built that level of comfort and confidence and resilience in communicating about it, then you can take the next step. You can begin to organize around it and build that sustainability of racial equity and bake it into the DNA of your city government so that it doesn't get discarded when you have a change in staff or a change in leadership. And operationalizing, which comes sort of in between the normalizing and the organizing, is rooted in the action that a city takes to make racial equity a lived reality. So we really want you to see that you are empowered as an organization, as a city, as a community, to take that on and make it part of the way you do business, make it a part of your policies and practices and procedures in Lake Worth Beach, so that equity is the outcome, equity for all. So how do we get there? How do we get to developing that shared understanding of history? We're going to walk you down a historical path here. Many things that you know, and that you may have forgotten, and many things that none of us don't know and were never taught in school. But this is something that is an important juxtaposition, and it's an exercise we like to take you through, sort of balancing the American values that we know our country was founded on, and then juxtaposing that with the reality of whether or not those values are lived values. So we're going to throw a statement up, and feel free to unmute yourself and just call out where you think the statement came from. The first one is, all men are created equal. Who remembers where that came from? What document in our American history?
Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence.
All right, this is a with it historical group, and your Lake Worth Beach history, which you shared with us, affirms that. So yes, that's from the Declaration of Independence. If you think about when that was written, what was it, 1770?
76.
That's right, that's right. Who were they really talking about in 1776 when they said, when our founders wrote, all men are created equal?
All white men are created equal.
That's all white men. What was another qualifier for that achievement of equality?
Property owner.
Property owners. So white men who own land were all created equal. And that is clearly stated in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the author, as you all know, is Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, a slave owner, and one whose equality was held above many others. So the value is there, the intent seemed to be clear, but the reality was something different. So another historical statement. With liberty and justice for all. What document or pledge?
Pledge of Allegiance.
All right. So this, again, a very historically savvy group. Anyone know when the Pledge of Allegiance was adopted or became part of our practice in this country?
It's late.
The 20s.
Later?
I think it was in the mid-century at some point, maybe post World War II.
It was actually adopted by Congress in 1942, so that's pretty darn close. So 1942, middle of the war, we were at war. And it said, that statement says, with liberty and justice for all. But let's juxtapose that with the reality of the time. Another historical fact, Brown versus Board of Education didn't end school desegregation until 1954. So in 1942, when the pledge was saying, with liberty and justice for all, was that in fact the reality? The Civil Rights Act ended segregation, wasn't signed until 1964. And the Voting Rights Act that gave everyone equal access to voting, at least a step closer, wasn't signed until 1965. But in 1942, we were claiming liberty and justice for all.
Did
So
they
again,
for women's rights?
and women's rights even later. Actually, in the 20s, we got suffrage, but there's some argument about equality there as well. So again, the value is stated, but the reality was something different and continues to be.
This is
So-
William Waters. Before you leave that, are you going to go into when the life part of that pledge was removed?
From the Pledge of Allegiance? No,
Yeah.
but tell me what,
Well, I know when I was growing up in North Carolina, we had life, liberty, and justice for all. And then with the proponents that implied that everybody could not have, well, we could not have capital punishment, life was removed from the Pledge of Allegiance.
wow.
It's basically acknowledging that we are a capital,
So we have capital punishment in our
Yes.
country. Yeah.
capital punishment.
Wow. What year was that? In the 60s?
I was, I think it was removed in the middle 70s, maybe.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Another angle to again, the value versus the reality and the amendment to it. So we have a third historical statement that most of you will get, because I understand that you guys are historically adept. Government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth.
We the people.
It does sound like the Constitution.
Gettysburg
But
Address.
that's right. That's right. Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg Address. Anyone remember what year?
1860. Mid 1800s.
Yeah, it was
1865?
It was
Or
actually
1860
earlier.
1863?
It was 1863, so right in the middle of the Civil War. So again, a statement that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth was the value that was clearly stated at a time when we were at our peak of division. So in the middle of that civil conflict in the 1860s, the aspiration was still toward equality, but it was not yet the reality. So again, the contrast is there. You can see that the values have been articulated, but the reality, the lived reality, is something much different. It's something that we need to keep leaning into. We need to keep being vigilant of and keep our commitment to not just aspiring to those words, but living them.
So we're starting kind of introducing some of this history, and we started with statements that may have been more familiar to you, the Declaration of Independence, Pledge of Allegiance, and Gettysburg Address, maybe not as familiar to most of us. But as we think about our history and continuing down this road of understanding race and government and understanding how that has showed up, we want to kind of talk about, go a little bit further, stuff that's not taught in schools, kind of our sticky history of understanding race. And we have a full packet we can send out to you as a follow-up that kind of really goes through a lot of things that we've learned as a team over the last couple of years on understanding a lot of that history that many of us did not know. But we wanted to bring some of that into this space in a more interactive way. We've uncovered a lot of different examples of history that some may be familiar and some less familiar as we go through it, but we wanted to use more of an interactive activity to see how well you did. You know, this is not one to call you out individually, but we wanted to go back to using the annotated feature. And so we're going to organize some examples of our history, policy, and moments in our history that fall into one of these 5 periods. As you can see here, we have pretty broad range of periods here from 1492 to 1699, from 1700 to 1899. And then we get a little bit more narrow from 1900 to 1949, 1950 to 1999, and 2000 to present. And so as we put up, we're going to put up an example of something that happened historically, whether it was a policy that passed or that really brought into context of understanding race and in our history. Want you to guess what period it is using the same annotated feature that you used for the Lay It on the Line. So I'm going to put up the first one. We're going to do about 12 of these, kind of go through it in fairly rapid order. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. Just wanted to kind of bring some of that history into the space, just acknowledging how well how much you know and how much you don't know. If you're guessing, did you guess right? Were you off as you were guessing? So I'm going to put up the first one. As you select your annotated feature, you can select yours and then guess what time period this statement happened. The state of Virginia makes slavery a hereditary form of bondage for enslaved Africans and their children. Virginia adopted the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, where a child born takes the status of the mother, exploited the power of slave owners and female slaves. Any guesses of which time period this happened? Take a moment and kind of guess what period and what year. Actually, there's a specific year when the state of actually makes this happen. The state of Virginia makes slavery a hereditary form of bondage. So see a number of you kind of guessing here now. We got 3 different ranges. Just giving you guys just a moment to put it up. All right, give you 10 more seconds. All right, looks like most of you are thinking in that 1700 to 1899, and it actually was 1662. 1662 when Virginia adopted that. And not going to say, and for those that guessed 1900, again, stuff that we did not learn in school, right? It's not necessarily supposed to be a condemnation of you should have known. It's just an acknowledgement we've never knew this and we never taught about this in school. I'm going to go on to the next one. This was a militia group organized by Captain John Lovewell to hunt Indians for a bounty. Hunt Indians, what year did that happen? This militia group being formed by Captain John Lovewell. Give you a second. And just kind of think how many folks have ever heard of Captain John Lovewell before, right? Think about stuff we don't know. All right, most of you kind of putting into 2 different periods. All right, looks like you guys are getting the flow of it. It's good. Almost looks kind of equally divided between the 2 periods, 1492, 1699, and 1700 and 1899. And for those that that chose 1700, 1899, you are correct. It was 1725. 1725 is when that militia group was formed. So that's our second one. We're going to do about 12 of these. Let's kind of go to our next one. This one was the gutting of the Voting Rights Act on the basis that our country has changed and that blanket federal protection wasn't needed to stop discrimination. So when did the gutting of the Voting Rights Act happen? The Voting Rights Act. All right. So the gutting of it, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. So our country has changed and that blanket federal protection wasn't needed to stop discrimination. All right. Looks like a lot of you fall into that 1950, 1999. And so for those that, I'm curious if anyone remembers what year the Voting Rights Act was actually passed. Again, not something necessarily taught in our schools. But for those that don't know when the Voting Rights Act was passed, it was actually 1965 is when it was actually passed. And so since 1965, it recently was gutted in 2014. So in 2014 is when the most recent Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts gutted the Voting Rights Act. So again, not something that we are taught in school or not even kind of aware of, but just kind of bringing race and understanding kind of that into context of our space. So I wanted to bring that one up. Let's go to the next one. This was where Blacks were prohibited from carrying firearms by Virginia law, which prescribed 20 lashes for violations of the statute. There was one exception. With his master's position, Blacks could bear firearms to defend against Indian raids. So what year did that happen? What year did that happen? So take some guesses again. Another Virginia law. All right. So yeah, looks like you guys are hitting the kind of the two periods here. I'm not sure it's even, looks like it's leaning, folks are leaning that 1700, 1899. All right, so for those that were in that 1700, 1899, it actually was 1639. 1639, so it happened before 1700. Again, not something I ever was taught or ever knew anything about. Again, just understanding so many aspects, again, so many aspects that we've learned about our laws. What about this one? This is called the creation of patty rollers. It was created in the Carolina colonies. This task was chasing down runaway Blacks, preventing revolts by Blacks, and dissembling meetings organized by Blacks. And so what year was that, year did that happen? Patty rollers, something, again, another term that, not something that, you know, if you haven't heard of it before. Looks like you guys are in that, again, between those two periods. Looks like most of you are in that 1700, and this time you're correct. It was 1704. 1704 is the period where that happened. So most of you kind of fell in the right period. Again, had you heard about it? I'm not sure how many folks have heard about it before, but I had not before learning about it. What about the Supreme Court case called Loving versus Virginia? This was a Supreme Court where it ruled that prohibiting interracial marriage is unconstitutional, forcing 16 states that still banned interracial marriage to change their laws. What year was that Supreme Court ruling? All right, great. Again, folks are in two different time periods here. Majority looks like you guys are in the 1950 to 1999. That's great. They actually made a movie of it. If you guys haven't seen the movie Loving, this is a movie that kind of described more of the dynamic that was connected to this court case. And it actually was in 1968. 1968 is when the Supreme Court ruled on that. You know, that, and so most of you kind of fell into that category, which is great. Not taught in schools, but I think movies had a way of helping us learn about some of our history too, for those that saw the movie. What about the Freedmen's Bureau? Freedmen's Bureau, when was that created? The Freedmen's Bureau, it provided food, housing, medical aid, established schools, offered legal assistance. It also attempted to settle Blacks on land confiscated or abandoned during the war. So when was the Freedmen's Bureau created? And again, have you heard of the Freedmen's Bureau? Again, another part of understanding our history. Looks like a lot of you are kind of guessing. Good. You're guessing in that 1700 to 1899. That's great. Yeah, and after the war, yeah, it was right after the Civil War. So it was 1865. 1865 is when the Freeman Bureau was created, right after the Emancipation Proclamation. So that was part of the, connected to that. All right, let's go on to the next one. What about Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act? Folks have heard of that. This act allowed some 200,000 Cambodian Vietnamese to enter the United States under what they call special parole status, and provided financial assistance for their settlement. Thoughts about when that was created? Yep. Most of you are kind of falling into that category. So yep, it was 1975. 1975 when that was created. So look, most of you kind of are hitting that, if not all of you, looks like. Now, this is the first publicly funded organized police force with officers on duty full time. This was located in Boston. When was the first publicly funded organized police force with officers on duty full time? That was Boston. It was organized to protect commercial properties on ports, but costs transferred to citizens under the guise of collective good. Under the guise of collective good. Right. A lot of you, it looks like a majority are falling into the 1700s to 1899. Okay. Well, that's great. I think impressive. That's 1838. 1838 is when that was the first publicly funded organized police force. So that's good. Most of you guys kind of fell into that space. The Federal Highway Act, which was under what they refer to as urban renewal. It committed $25 billion for the construction of the interstate highway system. The legislation didn't attribute for existing communities in areas of desirable construction locations. Communities of color across the country where interstates would be constructed were displaced and are separated from local amenities such as schools, supermarkets, churches, jobs, segregated whole communities. The Federal Highway Act. Okay, this one for you guys had a little bit more of a range in terms of where you were and when this happened. Looks like the majority were in the 1950 to 1999. And there are several of you in the 1900 to 1949. It actually was 1956. 1956 was when the Federal Highway Act was created, a lot of through that policy for a lot of communities of color. So again, that's another part of our history. The overhaul of Title IX. The overhaul of Title IX. This was where the administration changes Title IX, protecting survivors of assault from reducing liability of educational institutions from investigating claims of sexual misconduct, and it raised the protections for defendants. So when did the overhaul of Title IX happen? Under this administration. And they overhauled it. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, again, kind of between two ranges, again, the two time periods. Looks like the majority are saying 2000 to present, which is correct. It was actually just a couple of years ago, 2018, where the overhaul of Title IX happened, right? And so again, something that's happening more recent in our history, but again, just stuff that, you know, things that we may or may not have been paying attention to. And I'll do one more, which is the Federal Housing Administration redlining, which is the FHA determined areas that were deemed fit for investment by banks and other financial services companies, areas were physically demarcated with red shading on a map based primarily on the assigned risk level associated with an area's racial composition. So what year did FHA start the redlining? When was it started? Kind of went on for a period of time, but when did it start? Yeah, kind of actually covers two periods of when we experienced redlining, but when it started is kind of the question. When did it start? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, again, we have different, it looks like the majority are in the 1950 to 1999. And redlining actually started in 1934. 1934 is when it started. Went into the 60s, but it started in 1934. So if you think about the period of redlining of when it started in 1934. And so we wanted to do again, part of what we wanted to just really just acknowledge as we start to lean in, before we kind of go a little bit further, just acknowledging we don't do this to make you feel guilty, more so just like some of the stuff you probably knew. Looks like a lot of you either guessed really well or knew some of this stuff really well. And others, it's like I never knew about this part of our history. And that's really important as we are leaning in the space. We want to use this as an opportunity to show a kind of build on that as we are really talking about the history in our country. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to do a video and discussion kind of space. We want to show a first part of this clip. It's part of a 3-part series created by PBS and a number of foundations called Race, the Power of Illusion. And so we're going to show the first 20 minutes or so of the video that really talks about understanding race in our country. It's a lot of information to take in. It can be actually, there could be content in here that could be triggers and emotional. So we want to name that at the front end as you're sitting and engaging with some of the content. But we're going to play the first 20 minutes, have a discussion, take a break, and then come back and play the last part of it, have a discussion and wrap up in the time that we have together. So really want to encourage you to kind of lean in on this as you're listening, because there's a lot of rich history as we're just introducing some of it. This documentary really walks through what we think is a really helpful foundation for understanding race and history in this country. So I'm going to go ahead and press play and hope my sound works. And the video, are you guys seeing the video? Okay, great.
Yes. We don't hear anything though.
Should be coming soon, I think, or not. No, you're not hearing anything?
No, we were. It just started.
Yes, we were.
Are you guys hearing it? Okay.
Yes.
It is all around us. It is an illusion and yet profoundly real. What we perceive as race is one of the first things we notice about each other. Skin, darker or lighter. Eyes, round or almond, blue, black, brown. Hair, curly, straight, blonde, or dark. And attached to these characteristics is a mosaic of values, assumptions, and historical meanings. Even those of us who claim we don't believe the stereotypes can easily recite them.
The average person on the street thinks that race consists of differences in physical appearance. They also think that from looking at a person's physical appearance, that they can find out or know more subtle things about them. Race is not a level of biological division that we find in anatomically modern humans. There are no subspecies in the human beings that live today.
And that's quite shocking to a lot of individuals. When you look and you think you see race, to be told that no, you don't see race, you just think you see race. That, yeah, it's based on your cultural lens. That's extremely challenging.
Just because race isn't a biological reality doesn't mean it isn't real. Being classified as Asian or Black or Latino has never carried the same advantages in our society as being white
race in itself means nothing. The markers of race, skin color, hair texture, the things that we identify as the racial markers mean nothing unless they are given social meaning and unless there's public policy and private actions that act upon those kinds of characteristics. That creates race.
Physical differences don't make race. What makes race are the laws and practices that affect life chances and opportunities based on those differences. If we look carefully, we can see how our institutions and policies have assigned racial identities and reinforced racial inequality throughout the 20th century.
And this is something I think that all immigrant groups experience in one way or another when they come to America, no matter what point in time it is, because they come to a country that has historically always been highly racialized. It's a country where race has its origins in slavery, as well as in the conquest of Native American Indians. So anybody coming from the outside after that point has to fit into this racialized society in some way. And it's not always clear how people are going to fit in right away.
At the start of the 20th century, as millions of immigrants arrived from all over the world, lawmakers and social scientists debated how all of them, including the new European arrivals, would fit into the hierarchy of races already here. They came seeking economic opportunity, freedom, and a future for their families. Of the 23 million newcomers between 1880 and 1920, the vast majority were from Eastern and Southern Europe. Immigrants often work the hardest, poorest paying, and most dangerous jobs, along with the so-called inferior races already here: Blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese.
Cities with enormous slums developed as the ugly side of industrialization. Ugly both in terms of the aesthetic of American cities, but also ugly in terms of the solidifying of class differences and class tension. As all of those things became apparent, the immigrant became the symbol for what America might be becoming.
By 1910, 58% of American mining and factory workers were immigrants. Like Mexicans and African Americans, Italians, Slavs, and Jews were often desired as laborers, but also feared, seen as promiscuous, lazy, or stupid. Some saw it as a racial invasion. Charles Davenport, a famous biologist, expressed those fears in 1911. The population of the United States, wrote Davenport, will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigment, smaller in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sexual immorality. And the ratio of insanity in the population will rapidly increase.
And this was also a time when scientific race theory began to take off, and people began to look at society and look at groups of people in more racialized terms. So people were perceived as being separate races. So you had kind of a higher order of white races, which were seen as the Nordics, as opposed to what many of the nativists called the lower races of Europe.
There are various groups like the American Breeders Association, the Eugenics Research Association, who not only are doing research on various racial types, in this case, Hebrews, Slavs, Mediterraneans, what we would call now the Caucasian race, would break it down to 35 or 37 or 45 races for study. And a lot of the language was beginning to get at the idea that those differences were actually rooted in reproduction. They were rooted in heritable traits. They were heritable, they were biological, they were immutable.
The more the newcomers were forced into low-paying jobs and diseased tenements, the more these conditions were explained as natural consequences of their innate racial character. Biology was destiny. Which side of the racial divide you found yourself on could be a matter of life or death. Between 1890 and 1920, 2,500 African Americans were lynched in the South. In 1915, Leo Frank, a Jew living in Atlanta, was pulled from jail and hanged by a mob for allegedly killing a white girl. Writing about the lynching, a black journalist wondered, is the Jew a white man?
Some historians have suggested that these new immigrant groups from Europe were in-between peoples. They were in a transitional stage when compared to Anglo-Saxon Protestants, groups such as Italians or Jews were seen as not being fully white, perhaps. But when compared to African Americans or were compared to Asians, their whiteness became more salient, became more visible.
Could European ethnics become fully white and thus fully American? By 1910, a new term was entering popular culture to describe the transformation of Europeans. The phrase came from the title of a Broadway play by Israel Zangwill. God, said Zangwill, would melt down the races of Europe into a single pure essence, out of which he would mold Americans.
So when the Irish, when Germans, when Italians were coming and they didn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture, the idea was they will assimilate into Americanhood. They will become American, which in the American tradition has meant white American. But that melting pot never included people of color. Blacks, Chinese, Puerto Ricans, etc. could not melt into the pot. They could be used as wood to produce the fire for the pot, but they could not be used as material to be melted into the pot.
Whiteness was key to citizenship. In 1790, Congress had passed an act declaring that only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. After the Civil War, naturalization was extended to persons of African descent as well. But it was the white citizen who had clear access to the vote, sat on juries, was elected to public office, and had better jobs. Whiteness was not simply a matter of skin color. To be white was to gain the full rewards of American citizenship.
In order to be a naturalized citizen in this country, you had to be categorized as white or black. And almost everybody who tried to naturalize, all but I think one case that went to the Supreme Court, all of them were people trying to be categorized as white. So the court had to make decisions about who was white and who was not.
Courts and legislators had long been in the business of conferring racial identities. In the South, to enforce Jim Crow segregation and laws against mixed marriages, courts had to first determine who was black under law.
And here's where it really gets interesting. You got some places, for example, Virginia law defined a black person as a person with 1/16 African ancestry. Now, Florida defined a black person as a person with 1/8 African ancestry. Now, Alabama said, you're black if you got any black ancestry, any African ancestry at all. But you know what this means? You can walk across a state line and literally, legally change race. Now, what does race mean under those circumstances? You give me the power, I can make you any race I want you to be, because it is a social, political construction.
In 1909, American courts had that power. That year, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Massachusetts ruled that Armenians, often classified as Asiatic Turks, were legally white. If Armenians could be designated white, what of the other so-called Asiatic races? Filipinos, Syrians, the Japanese. Could they also petition successfully to be designated white by the courts and thus become Americans? In 1922, when Japanese businessman Takao Ozawa petitioned the Supreme Court for naturalization, many in the Japanese community believed his was the perfect test case.
Takao Ozawa came from Japan, went to the University of California at Berkeley for a few years, then moved to Hawaii where he had a family, and he applied to become a naturalized citizen in 1915.
My father wrote his own brief and everything, and he was really devoted. He wanted to become an American citizen, and nothing would stop him. He was determined.
Japanese growers in California watched Ozawa's case closely. By 1920, a series of Alien Land Acts prohibited many non-citizens from owning or leasing land. Without a legal designation of whiteness to make them citizens, Japanese immigrants could not have the full protection of American law, no matter how long they lived in the country. In his brief, Ozawa argued that his skin was as white as any so-called Caucasian, if not whiter. But he made a much more important second argument.
But his second argument was that race shouldn't matter for citizenship. What really mattered was a person's beliefs.
My honesty and industriousness are well known among my Japanese and American friends. In name, Benedict Arnold was an American, but at heart he was a traitor. In name, I am not an American, but at heart, I am a true American.
The articles would come out in the paper. I thought, oh, what did he do? You know, I thought only bad things came out in the paper, and I was kind of ashamed, you know, when I was a child. And it was just the way we were brought up. I didn't have any Oriental friends. My neighbors were all Caucasian. And so he was so determined to get us, well, when the time came to be American citizens.
The Supreme Court ruled that Ozawa could not be a citizen. They said he was not white within the meaning of the statute and therefore not eligible to citizenship. And the court said, well, he's not white because he's not Caucasian, and Caucasians are whites. He did everything right. He learned English. He had a lifestyle that was American. He went to Christian church on Sunday. He dressed as a Westerner. He brought up his children as Americans. He did everything he was supposed to do. and yet he's told that he can't be a citizen because he's not white.
The court ruled that according to the best-known science, Ozawa was not Caucasian, but of the Mongolian race. But the court would not be bound by science in policing the boundaries of whiteness. Only 3 months after Ozawa, the court took up the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, a South Asian immigrant and U.S. Army veteran who petitioned for citizenship on the grounds that Indians were of the Aryan or Caucasian race, and therefore white.
And he makes the scientific argument, having learned something actually from the Ozawa case, that he is Caucasian. He gets scientific authority to speak on his behalf, that in fact South Asians are included in the Caucasian race.
So here the court was in a bind because they were presented with so-called scientific evidence that Indians were Caucasian. And the court solved this problem by saying that it didn't matter what science said, so-called science. They actually said white is not something that can be scientifically determined, but white is something that is subjectively understood by who they called the common person, the common man.
It may be true, reasoned the court, that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. The same court that used science to determine whiteness in Ozawa 3 months before now refuted its own reasoning in Thind. Thind might well be Caucasian, the High Court said, but he was not white. The justices never said what whiteness was, only what it wasn't. Their implied logic was a circular one. Whiteness was what the common white man said it was.
The court often decided who was white and who wasn't based on whether they just felt that the person would politically fit well into the kind of society that we were trying to build. And sometimes it was pretty explicit that this is what the court was doing.
There was widespread racial views that Asians were undesirable, that they threatened to contaminate the American society. Basically, that Asians are too different, that they can never really become like the rest of us.
The consequences of the unanimous verdict in U.S. versus Thind were catastrophic for the Indian community. South Asians who had naturalized before the verdict were stripped of their citizenship and property. Vaishno Das Begai was a successful merchant who fled British tyranny in India to raise his family in a free country. After his American citizenship was revoked, he took his own life. He left a suicide note for his family and another for the public. But now they come and say to me I am no longer an American citizen. What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. We cannot leave this country. Humility and insults, blockades this way, and bridges burned behind. For the Japanese community, the verdicts in the Ozawa and Thind cases were equally devastating. Now, as aliens ineligible for citizenship, many growers were unable to purchase or even lease land to stay in business. Thousands of acres were seized from Japanese immigrants and sold to white farmers. By the time the racial requirement for naturalization was finally removed in 1952, Takawa Ozawa was long dead.
The notion that Asians are racially unassimilable and that they're ineligible to citizenship because of their race is something that I think has had a real enduring effect. The fact that they were seen as non-American enabled many Americans to see them as the enemy and to strip them totally of their civil liberties and to put them in internment camps during World War II. The legacy of this idea is that even those who are third or fourth generation Asian Americans are still perceived as foreigners.
In 1924, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which effectively banned Asian immigration until 1965. Johnson-Reed also cut immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe to a trickle.
Your blood's the same as mine. Mine's the same as his. Do you know what this wonderful country is made of? It's made up of
World War II found the U.S. at war with Nazi Germany and Japan. Films like the 1945 Oscar-winning short, The House I Live In, called for national unity and ethnic tolerance.
What is America to me? A name.
And these other distinctions which had carried so much power in an earlier period, Celt, Slav, Anglo-Saxon, started to fade away. They had no purchase because those distinctions didn't seem to hold the key to any social questions that were worth answering anymore. The more important and more pressing political social questions seemed to hinge on black and white.
All races and religions.
Sinatra's song was one of tolerance, but the line that sang of "my neighbors black and white" was cut from the film.
So long, man.
European immigrants were learning that whiteness was more than skin color. It was the privilege of opportunity, and above all, exclusive.
There's this whole very standard narrative of the European mobility model. We came here with nothing. We worked hard. We pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. And it's offered up as proof of the openness of the American economic order.
Left out of the bootstrap myth of European ethnics was access to opportunities close to non-whites. Roosevelt's New Deal reforms offered many Americans a path out of poverty.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 50 million of our citizens.
But the original Social Security program excluded farm workers and domestics, most of whom were non-white. And many unions locked blacks and Mexicans into low-paying jobs or kept them out altogether. But perhaps the best example of how European ethnics would finally gain the full benefits of whiteness came with an innovation in housing at the end of World War II.
All right. Want to come on back?
Right here.
So we know that that's a lot of information, a lot of content to take in within those couple 20 minutes or so. And as I said, it might have created some triggers content-wise, understanding some of our history. And so we as facilitators are just very mindful of the importance of self-care. It's a lot to take in. And so just want you to take a moment, for each of you, if you could just take a deep breath in and let it out. Take a deep breath in one more time. You know, I can see some of y'all, right? That some of y'all not taking your deep breaths in. Like you know, camera, I can still see you, and let it out. All right. Again, just very mindful. You know, some of you might have known some of that history, and as you're sitting with it, wanting to that's a good stopping point, just to create a space for for us to kind of process kind of what was really kind of what you were sitting with. Let me pause it. What we would like to do, because it's such a large group, wanted to see if we, Rita and I wanted to see if we could break you up into 2 groups randomly, and to see if we could facilitate a more smaller group discussion, since it's so many of you in one group. Let me turn to Rita here to see if we are in position to be able to do that. I see a thumbs up.
We are, except I might need Keith's help because I know the commission is all in one room together. So Keith, if you could make sure all the commissioners join group 1 or group 2 together so that no one gets left out of the conversation. Keith, are you with me?
Keith, are you there?
Take a break.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, did you hear my question?
No.
Okay, I'll repeat. We're going to do 2 breakout groups, or we'd like to make it smaller group conversation, but not too small. But we'd like the commissioners all to come into group 1 if that's possible. I'm gonna hit a random, but then if you could move all the commissioners into group 1, that would be great. Can you do that?
So if you're just going to assign them automatically and then just I'll move them back.
Yes, you move
Yep, that
all
works.
commissioners into group 1 since they're together in one room. We don't want anyone to miss the conversation.
Done.
Okay, so I'm going to hit create, Leon. And if you take group 1, I'll take group 2.
Excellent. All right, and Rita, and just because we have another video to show, let's keep this about 7 minutes, just for
7.
a quick debrief. Yeah.
Perfect.
So you guys should be seeing an announcement coming to join a group. I just got mine. See you guys in the group.
See you there. All right, Keith, since I created it, you're going to have to put me in group 2. Can you do that?
Your volume's off, Keith.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if I can move you now. 1 sec.
Great.
Well,
Or I could probably ask to join.
yeah, you should be.
Let me.
1 sec here. Oh wait, here we go. Breakout rooms.
Send me to group 2.
Assign to room 2.
Thank you.
Did you forget about us?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can't hear anybody else. We're not in a
They're
group.
all coming back. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, we got remerged. Can we set it at 5 minutes, Keith?
Yeah, 1 second. I'm going to assign everybody to a room.
Okay.
So you guys can just assign automatically.
think we've all learned to give each other grace in this technology virtual space, knowing that there's always the unexpected.
And it takes the whole village, so we appreciate Lake Worth Beach's support.
All right, I'm going to room 2 now.
Great.
Okay, so we should have, so I have, Rita, did I get you assigned to a room?
I'm in this room. You
Okay.
did not assign me.
Well, I had, yeah, because I had 2 rooms and then I have the main unassigned room, which is the commission, which I think that's why they're not moving.
Okay.
So, but you should have been assigned to a room. So you should be in room 1 or 2.
And I'm in the main room, but I didn't get an invitation. But I can see it, so.
Yeah, because you should be in room 1. So the commission is the only one that's not assigned to a room.
Okay, great. So I will join group 1. Great.
So commission, you guys are still live streaming during this period. This is a breakout room period, and the breakout rooms are not streamed. They're private rooms for discussion beyond this. So this is the only room that's still streamed. There's nothing, they're completely actively doing something right now in these 2 rooms. I just assigned them as needed.
So Keith, can I join with my fellow commissioners?
Your commissioner, you and your fellow commissioners are in this room, so they can hear you. They're muted right now.
Okay.
But you guys are in one room, so you guys are live.
Hey, can you hear us?
Yes.
Herman, can you hear us?
Okay, good. Lovely.
Hi, Herman.
Hi, Herman.
Hey.
This is Commissioner Amoroso. I was going to make a comment based on what we saw. So the mayor and I have had conversations along these lines before about growing up Italian. And I remember stories being told where the Italians were the dirty wops.
Yeah.
Very much like, what we're going through today with different cultures, but we were the dirty wops, and wop meant without papers. And, we were quite often, the lower hierarchy in our communities. And, we grew up, not me personally, but our families grew up. My mother was one of 11 brothers and sisters. So, I remember, some of those stories growing up.
I remember my dad telling stories about when he first started his business, and in probably in the late 60s, and him telling the story about how he started his business and he went to sell a client in Connecticut, because we were from New York. And he went there and he was all excited. He wore his best suit to go to this country club or this whatever, and to have lunch and play golf. And they was going to meet the GE Finance Company, I think at the time. And the guy says, "I'm sorry, you can't come in." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "They don't let any Italians in this country club, and you can't play golf, you can't have lunch, you can't do anything." And I remember him coming back. I mean, you just don't hear those stories. You think Italian food, Italian, everyone knows Italian, this, that, and the other thing. But they said they were pretty much, when they came over here, they were farmers. A lot of the Italians that came, they immigrated here were farmers from and worked out in the fields. And those were the jobs that they got, much like, people today that are immigrating here. And they sent their money back to their home countries. And they, it's a lot of the same kind of stuff. Sort of, if you look at some of the Spanish cultures today, a lot of similarities to it, but, it is what it is. Was the time my dad's first generation, but my grandparents spoke Italian.
Yeah, my grandparents were little tiny people and spoke Italian.
And they, and a lot of the kids died. They were in, they grew up in the city in Hell's Kitchen or wherever the heck they grew up in, and a lot of the little ones died. It was two of my dad's brothers died, but it was the way it happened. The Italians, I think, were probably more the 20s. Like 22, 25, 1925, I think was the biggest Italian immigration.
Herman wanted to say something.
I'm sorry, Herman, go ahead.
Just in watching the video, there is hope. Having seen the change from immigration from Ellis Island to today, we need to pick up the pace, but there has been change, and that gives me hope that we can change. We can change.
Herman, did you ever see or know about the story about the young Jewish man that was hung because he tried to, I think it was because he tried to talk to a white woman?
No, he was accused, but anyhow, no, but I have been called Jew boy by in the last 50 years.
Yeah. And I obviously have been called faggot and queer. And I remember standing in a restaurant line one time with my mother when she was alive, and somebody behind us said faggot. And my mother turned around and said, "They don't call them faggots, they call them homosexuals." I said, "Okay, you go, Mom."
One thing that amazes me is all throughout history, and even now, every other race, every other ethnicity would be able to assimilate or have that opportunity at some time. African Americans are judged by the color of their skin.
Correct.
So we could never fade into the background or be something that we're not. And so when people see you, that's what they see. And even though I have many, many friends in Lake Worth, the first thing they see is the fact that I'm Black. And until we change that dynamic, we won't have equality.
Agreed.
And it's so prevalent now. And in the last couple of years, people have forgotten how to be civil.
Yes.
It used to be that you may be prejudiced, but you weren't rude and nasty and you weren't calling people names. Now it's gotten much worse, and you see it in small ways. It's the people who cut in front of you in line, or the people know that you're standing there and they'll say, "I'm next." And it puts the poor burden on the young worker at Publix to be able to say, "No, you're not." Right. And most times they don't say anything because they don't want to get involved in that.
Right.
So we have to be willing to change the dynamic in Lake Worth. And if we don't, I don't think that our city will ever achieve equality. I really don't.
I'd like to talk for a moment because an Indian friend of mine, she made some of those same comments, and she said, "You might be able to hide that you're gay, but I cannot hide that I'm Indian, and I also cannot hide that I'm a woman."
Yes.
Because we know that not only people of color, but women are discriminated against just because they are women. So
I sit on both sides of those fences.
Correct. That's why I address
say, well, you're a Black woman, you really have to take a step back. And I choose my battles, and I am very passionate about who I am and raising children and young people to know that regardless of how someone else sees you, how do you see yourself? And that is who you take with you. And so I was often told, you talk like you're white, you act like you're white, And I would say, what does that mean? Does that mean that I didn't learn the same English that you did in school? You know, and then people are offended. How dare you question my knowledge that I've given to you? You know, we all earn our place in life, but I can't let someone take it away from me by the color of my skin. And it's very, very, very hard, especially in this America. Yeah, and you can't escape it.
Well, and I totally agree with you when you made the comment that people have gotten bolder. It used to be that people were they may have been racist, but they were proper. They weren't as bold or boisterous. Now, in the last 4 years, they've gotten a lot bolder, you know, in your face. They want to start a fight for no apparent reason.
The hate is stronger.
Yes.
It seems more extreme. I mean, I was born in the 1960s. You know, we were kind of like the kids that grew up in, you know, my oldest brother was 8 years older than me, and he had been through a lot of race wars in the high schools and things that had happened. And me, I grew up with, you know, Mr. Rogers and you know, different, you know, Sesame Street and different kinds of shows that talked about, that kind of showed the differences of people. And we grew up with that as examples, and it was a different time. And then growing up in New York, a public school system, it was half the school was Black and Hispanic. So I never thought about it. I never really experienced any issues of racism that I noticed growing up as a kid, but I've always been rose-colored glasses kind of person, you know, love everybody. You know, we were the 60s generation, you know, and inequality for everybody. And then I came down to Florida, and it was a rude awakening. And I never realized that it was the South. You know, you see the South as examples in the country. You don't think of Florida as the South. Well, it's the deep South, you know, and I didn't know that things, when I first got here, I was 23 years old, 24 years old. I didn't know that things actually still existed.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You know, and I'm listening to Commissioner Bloxham and her comment about the statement that maybe she's heard that, you know, they couldn't tell that she was Black because of the way she spoke. That was the most interesting thing that I saw, because I grew up in a military family and moved around. I didn't see, you know, they were all different kinds of kids I grew up with. And from the Northeast, I didn't realize that this is really going to put me out there in big trouble. But
I want to make sure, just as you're talking, you know, you came back to the larger room. So I want to make sure you know that whoever's talking, I can't see you. We're back in the larger room, but finish your thoughts. I want to make sure folks, if you feel comfortable finishing your thought.
They're live. They've been live.
But it's, you know, different parts of the country, all of us have different, I guess, dialects, if you will. And my exposure, I never saw the Black community speaking any other way than the way I spoke, because of my moving around the way I did. And yes, there is in some cases a dialect difference here in Florida or in the South. But like I say, this is a situation where, and then you brought this up, Commissioner, more bold, or some folks are being more bold. I think in large part, we can blame the social media for that. I think people have been emboldened to be, who maybe 20 years ago, I don't know if there's any such thing as a polite racist. I think that's what you tried to point out earlier. You said that they were racist, but they were polite, or they weren't overt about it. But I think that with social media, I think what's happening is some folks are now coming out and using that as their vehicle, and people are finding it more acceptable to interact that way. And it's not acceptable to interact that way. So, you know, we've got a lot of things that we have to fight. And I think that's something we need to factor into all these equations. It's a lot different than when we interact with each other personally than it is when we interact with somebody that maybe has a screen name or is hiding behind a you know, so that's adds another layer of challenge to getting where we need to be.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Like they thought our parents thought that our generation back in the '60s, we were going to be the one that was going to change things and change that. And I feel like, again, like the rose-colored glasses, that I look at people today and I look at my nieces and nephews and they don't see any, you know what I mean? It's just people. They don't see, and I'm sure there are people that do, but in those generations, but they're much more, they don't see race, they don't see religion, they don't see sexuality, they're much more, I don't know, I see that, I thought that they were, when somebody mentioned earlier about, you know, is it being positive or is it just thinking, you know, we're gonna have to wait for generations. I forget who mentioned that. We may have to wait for generations to erase racism because we keep thinking it's gonna happen, but there's always gonna be people that hate, you know, I can't explain it any other way.
So I'd like to bring us all back together. It sounds like you guys are ready to jump in. I should just leave y'all to keep going, but can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, so we do have, I want to find out just a quick check. We want to play the second part. We're running about 15 minutes behind. I want to pause. I know we've had some technical problems that's caused this, but we also want to be respectful of your time, knowing how we've planned out the agenda. Wanting to see if it's okay if it's not okay, we will plan accordingly. But that's why I wanted to check before we lean into the second portion of the video. If we can extend this to 15 minutes past, and we promise to end by 7:45. If not, if you feel like you need a hard stop at 7:30, Reed and I can, you know, figure out how to make an adjustment there on our end.
We're fine.
There's a football event at 8 that they don't want to miss. So 7:45 should work, right?
Yes.
Are we going to take a quick break at all for a bathroom break or no?
Yes, we can take let's take a 5. We can definitely take a 5-minute bio break, and then we can come back and do the second part of the video.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Bio break, yes.
All right, if we can make our way back. Welcome back, everyone. We're in the final stretches. Again, we know that everybody here wants to be able to, we want to make sure we get you seated in time to be able to watch the college football championships between Alabama and Ohio State. And as we're doing this, folks are returning back. This second portion of the video is really going to lean a little bit further into understanding the implications of how we've defined race, and that goes beyond just understanding who is a citizen and who's not a citizen. And so I want to play it again. I want to be mindful of the time. So I want to kind of make sure we're leaning in and giving a chance for folks to sit with the rest of the content here. So I'm gonna go ahead and press play. Are you guys hearing it?
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
Living space was at a premium. In the Bronx, they tried building Quonset huts, and they turned to slums. All the Quonset huts had just disintegrated. There were two families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by ensuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly...
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment,
We found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
They say your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and a...
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you. You know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist. But for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past, whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian. It now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way, a utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which were called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were Black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we had bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly black.
It was called blockbusting. Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say, you know, we're having black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
As more black and Latino families moved to Roosevelt, real estate became more and more depressed, just as the FHA had predicted. But why?
I have an idea my house is probably worth around 120 in this town. But what it would be worth in Wantor or Garden City or some other place, probably around 200,000 or better. Now you're talking about 80,000. You said to me one time about why do people dislike the blacks? Well, money-wise, there's a reason. Not that you dislike the blacks so much, but you dislike what happens when a community turns from white to black.
It wasn't African Americans moving in that caused housing values to go down in Roosevelt and other neighborhoods. It was whites leaving.
When a neighborhood, a previously white neighborhood, starts to integrate, even if individual whites don't have personal or psychological animosity or racial hatred, they still have an economic incentive to leave because they recognize that others might make the same calculation and leave first. So you get a vicious circle where whites calculate that other whites are going to sell when a neighborhood integrates, therefore they want to sell first to avoid losses, and they actually make it happen. They make white flight happen.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in black communities.
So there's a difference. There's a lack of symmetry that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the same when whites are all by themselves, because when they're all by themselves, they're taking all the resources with them. They're taking all the amenities with them. But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans. They don't have a decent tax base. There are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space.
In the end, what happened to Roosevelt happens in many neighborhoods when white families and businesses flee. The tax base eroded. Schools and services declined. The town was seen by county officials as a legitimate dumping ground for welfare families.
At one point, we had explicit laws that says whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom. Today we have many of the same practices without the explicit language. And those practices are largely inscribed in geography. And so geography does the work of Jim Crow laws. So many people are confused as why after 50 years of civil rights are our schools still segregated? Why are our housing markets still segregated? Why are our jobs still segregated? And again, a lot of this is a function of how we've reinscribed the racial geographic space in the United States. That structure is still what we're living with today.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. That house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgaged that house so I could have, you know, a relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? You know, well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of a racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
To glimpse one of the far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.
We want to be a colorblind society that values the content of character over the color of skin. The hope of thousands of newcomers who arrive each year is that we already are.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic of which
I don't see color. I see people. The saying goes.
There are people from 100 other nations who look different from you. People whose religion, history, skin color, and reason for being here today may be different from yours.
But in post-civil rights America, is color blindness the same as equality?
The notion of color blindness came to us from that famous I Have a Dream speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, where he said that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of the skin. And what has happened in the post-civil rights era is that whites have assumed that we are already there, that we're in a society where color does not matter.
On the one hand, the civil rights era officially ended inequality of opportunity, officially ended de jure legal inequality. At the same time, those civil rights triumphs did nothing to address the underlying economic and social inequalities that had already been in place. It doesn't recognize the fact that the rewards, the house, the Lexus, the big bank account, those are not only the rewards of the pot of gold at the end of the game, they're also the starting position for the next generation.
The wealth gap grows. The advantages of being white accumulate from one generation to the next.
What are the benefits or the advantages to being white in a society that has historically given benefits and advantages to members of the dominant group? And if you are a person who has that privilege, you don't necessarily notice it.
So until we recognize that there's really no way to talk about equality of opportunity without talking about equality of condition, then we're stuck with this paradoxical idea of a colorblind society in a society that's totally unequal by color.
Claiming we don't see race won't end racial inequality. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way.
And just as we're born into this system, we don't ask to be loaded up with stereotypes or omissions or distortions when we come into the world. We don't ask to be in a structure which is unfair, but that's what we have inherited. Whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a white person, it doesn't matter.
I think we have to be uncomfortable with the present racial arrangement. In a sense, I think we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to demand more of ourselves and more of our country, and willing to make the invisible visible.
I think we all have to think about, what can I influence? I don't influence everything, but the things I do influence, I can think about, how am I making this a more equitable environment? I can ask myself, who's included in this picture and who isn't? Who's had opportunities in my environment and who hasn't? What can I do about that?
All right. Appreciate everyone taking a moment to allowing us to get through the second portion of the video. Again, just want to, we will pick up on this when we continue back tomorrow afternoon, having you a chance to process. If we had, but I do want you to take the evening to have a chance to kind of reflect on the last part of this video, and we'll create a space for a discussion tomorrow as we start back tomorrow. But again, we just want to want to end just allowing you kind of to just again manage yourself and self-care here for a moment. So just asking for you to with us, with Rita and I, take some deep breath in and let it out. Take another deep breath in and let it out. And just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of information to sit with. Depending on where you are on this journey, you might be hearing a lot of this for the first time. So want to create the space for you to reflect when we come back together. Again, we want to thank you for allowing us to go a little bit past time. We apologize for the technical difficulties. Hopefully we will have less of that tomorrow. Let's be hopeful, knock on wood. And look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow at 4:30. I'm not sure who you're rooting for, if it's Roll Tide. I went to Michigan, so if you really want to feel and vote, support anyone that's not Big Ten, it's all about Alabama. But, each of you to your own. And enjoy the game tonight, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you. Thanks for all your support and for your engagement. Bye.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
All those in favor? Aye. Aye. Got you, Herman? Okay.